I am Dr. Kelli Morgan. I'm a critical race cultural historian. So my work really champions African American art.
Hi everybody, it's Dr. Kelli Morgan here to talk to you today about equity in the arts, or maybe the lack thereof, more specifically stated. There's, so much conversation happening right now in the art world, particularly the museum world, about equity and inclusivity and diversity, with no real action behind it, right? To be real honest about it. And so in this video, or in this lecture, I wanted to provide a window into some of the work that I did in equity and inclusivity during my time as the curator of American art, or associate curator of American art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, a position that I recently resigned in mid-July of this year. My resignation was very public, and that was purposeful on my part, because I really wanted the public, or visitors, right, audiences to see, and even colleagues across the country, to see what it looks like, when an institution wants to be, or claims that it wants to be dedicated, right, or committed to equity, issues of equity and inclusion and diversity, and wants to develop that culture, but isn't really ready, right, doesn't have the structures to put that particular money where their mouth is. And one of the most egregious things about Newfields as an institution when it comes to issues of inequity, it's literal geographic location within the city. When you're driving north, up Martin Luther King Boulevard, and you get to 38th Street. 38th Street is the hard red line in Indianapolis. You reach a light and you see this image, right? So if you're sitting at the light, Newfields in the museum, is on the left-hand side of the street, and the cemetery, right, is on the right side of the street. And so it really forms this gate, right? The other thing that's really interesting about this, and this happens in, this is not, unique to Indianapolis, it happens in all cities, but the street name changes, right? So on the south side of 38th, it's MLK Boulevard. On the north side of 38th, it's Michigan Road, right? So again, as a critical race theorist, right, and we're talking about equity and inclusion, these are the geographical markers, right, of systemic racism. These are also the verbal, right, or linguistic markers of geographical racism. So the institution itself, right, has an issue right at its gate. So right out of the gate, of my tenure as associate curator of American art, that was one of the first things, that I mentioned to people. It's like, if we are going to actually address the lack of equity, in this institution, we have to address where we actually sit, like what we represent to people visually. So to a certain degree, it's like a, don't pass go, don't collect $200, kind of gate, sitting right at our entrance. So we're not dealing with that first, right? If we're not starting there, or at least, willing to acknowledge that, as an institution, that's a problem. And that didn't necessarily, get much traction, of course. And so again, as a curator, I'm pretty much approaching, American art and I think the museum space, right, as a space that really codifies whiteness, specifically white male identity, right? So if we're gonna implement any type of equity, or any type of system of equity or culture of equity, again, we have to first be able to acknowledge, right, the realities of why the inequities are there, right? So again, like I said, all this conversation is happening, about equity in the museum field right now, but nobody's actually talking about why, right? It's like, oh, it's
4% of, museum professionals are Black. Okay, there's a reason for that, right? Right? 90% of museum collections, are white artists or white male artists. There's a reason for that. And in the installation, reinstallation I'm going to walk you guys through today, I really wanted to tease out the why. I really wanted to show people or maybe make is a better way to say it. I really wanted to make people grapple, right, with the why of all of these questions. And so the grounding question, that really, I think is the fulcrum upon which that turns for me, in my curatorial philosophy, is how can curators activate, permanent collections, and I would say museum spaces, through methodologies that directly address the realities of racism. And one of the answers to that question is that you have to reinterpret the artwork itself. So the reason why reinterpretation is so important, I think is so integral. It's not the only thing, but I think it's a very integral thing when we talk about creating cultures of equity. Reinterpretation is so important because the narrative in and of itself is inherently racist, sexist, and biased. And one of the things that I cannot stand, about museum and art historical narratives is that it's this assumption that in order to include African diasporic work, indigenous objects, and works by indigenous nations to the American narrative, that it's this counter narrative, right? As if it's something separate, right, than what was happening, in the country as a whole, right? So like how we always say, it ain't Black history, it's American history, right? It's not Native American history, it's American history. And the reason why that just boils my blood is because the burden of why the counter narrative is even required, right, or why it's even necessary, is often put on communities in nations and groups of color. And what I often try to do in my curatorial practice, again, we talking about equity, is I try to shift that burden back on the people that created the circumstances for it to exist in the first place, right? So I try to shift that burden back on white folks, and again, the narrative is told in a way where it's seemingly representing, white artists, right, or white people, or in whiteness. And I mean, that is true. But if you read past the whiteness, right, and honestly, the mythology of whiteness, you can find very easily all the people of color, and all of the cultural contexts, that are related, and connected to people of color, within those works. Most of the time, the work is just not interpreted that way because the work is created by a white artist, right? And so when you start thinking about the American context, right, and not the white context, you get a very, very different story. And so my first attempt, right, it wasn't really my first, because I had done this in my previous position at PAFA as well. But doing this, again, as a collections curator, my first attempt, or my first go at it in Indy, was working with these two works that you see here. The Angel of Resurrection by Louis Comfort Tiffany, designed by Frederick Wilson, and Glow of Gold, Gleam of Pearl by William McGregor Paxson. So why these two works? Why this space? Well, these two works, hung or hang currently in the Rotunda Gallery at the IMA at Newfields, which is a very beautiful space, right? It can be a very ethereal space. It's a very meditative space. This is an image of yoga in that gallery. Yoga happens in that gallery all the time. People come to this space again to meditate, to pray, just to get away. And the other reason why I chose this space is because it's a very Indiana specific space, right? So the painting to your left is a painting by Theodore Grohl of downtown Indianapolis in the 1890s. I'll get to the Tiffany Windows Indiana connection in a minute. This painting to your right over here is a painting of a young white female sitter by Indiana artist Ruth Pratt Bobbs. in you can't see these two paintings, but you know, you can't, the Paxton is on one of the walls that's out of the frame, and there was a Cecilia Bow painting of an older female sitter on one of the other walls that's out of the frame. You know, so it was a very Indiana specific space, but it was also a very white space, right? So where folks can come in and do yoga and have these meditative, meditative experiences, other people can come into this space and feel very oppressed, and feel very, feel the starkness, right, of it. Everybody doesn't walk into a space and experience it the same way, and that doesn't always have to do with race either, right? But in this case, it's super clear. And so, asking myself, as I walk through, as a new curator, what would my Muslim students, say, upon entering this space? What would my Black students say, upon entering this space? What would my Native students say, upon entering this space? Hell, just with the gender dynamics, right, with the female sitters, what would my queer students say, upon entering this space? And one can walk into the space and appreciate the work aesthetically, right? Nobody's questioning, like the technical form, right? Or that they're rendered in a very excellent way. Nobody's really questioning that, but it's like outside of that, how can other people, relate to this work? And again, or even how can people relate to this work, but then also why? Right, is this work installed in the way that it is? And the more I got into, investigating that, right, and researching that, the more my, again, critical race study, came up. And one, very, very central quote to me upon my first reading of In the Wake, way back, was this particular passage. It's like, how do we, or I'm thinking of myself, like, how do I, as a curator, grapple, right, with these afterlives, right? So if this is a very specific space, right, that the museum has created its own pedagogy, unique to whiteness, unique to white femaleness, and also unique to white Indiana, right? So there's a pedagogy there. There's also a pedagogy that's there in terms of aesthetic spirituality, right? Like I said, meditation, yoga, that kind of thing. So it's set up, right, for people to have a very particular set of experiences if you look a certain way, right? Because I didn't walk into the space, feeling very ethereal. I didn't walk into the space, feeling light, at all. And so if this is how the space, if this is how museums are setting up spaces, as Christina Sharp says here, and I'm not going to read the quote to you. I know you can read it on your own. How do we deal, right, with the memorialization of whiteness, of chattel slavery, of, the genocide of First Nations, and the afterlives of which are still unfolding? And this is why I'm coming back to this reinstallation, for this piece, because here we are again, 2020, fighting for, pushing for, challenging, asking, demanding the exact same things, that Black revolutionaries were asking for in the 70s, that, civil rights workers and SNCC, CORE, SCLC were asking for in the 1950s, the exact same thing that the NAACP and its, sort of 5-6 point plan were asking for in the 1920s, right? And on and on and on and on and on. I can go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, right? And the list of demands is the same, and so again, there's a reason for that, right? And I think in this moment we are beginning to actually kind of talk about the realities of that and the truth of that. Museums, on the other hand, are not necessarily owning up, as efficiently, right, and sufficiently, as they can to that. And so for me, again, coming into the space, that was the first thing that, that I really wanted to tackle. I wanted to say, well, let me unpack some of this for y'all, to show you, right, one, how, you can tell a very different story, if you put the work in its broader historical context, right? So and even in looking at a work like Angel of Resurrection, which was commissioned by the widow of our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison, Mrs. Benjamin Harrison. It was commissioned in 1901, and it was installed in First Presbyterian Church in downtown Indianapolis in 1905 as an ode, to her husband, his Union Army tenure, both, his time as president, as well as his time as an elder and, very active in First Presbyterian Church throughout his life. And so you have, again, this is commissioned, upon his passing. So you have, Archangel Michael in this piece, summoning the dead, for the second coming of Christ. And, upon, again, first look, there's nothing really like too fabulous about that, right? Or unusual about that. Michael is in his typical role, with his horn. But what was super interesting to me, one was the wordage, right? So the verb is, so awaken thou that sleepest, arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. So one, that's the Bible verse. But the fact that it was juxtaposed across from this work, right? Again, glow of gold, gleam of pearl, 1906. And this is kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an unusual piece for Paxson, but it's not his typical style, right? Just in terms of size, as well as the subject matter, very ethereal white female nude. So in my musings, over the space, I said, this is a very interesting picture to have hung, with a Tiffany window. Now, sometimes it could be due to space, a lot of times, there isn't always, right, a connective narrative. Sometimes museums or curators will hang stuff, maybe there's not enough space in storage, maybe there's not enough space on painting racks, so you have to keep things in the gallery. But what I found fascinating about it, once I dug a little bit more into who Benjamin Harrison was, it worked perfectly, for kind of where my mind was going with this. So Benjamin Harrison, 23rd president of the United States. He was, he did serve in the Union Army. And he did, help, Black families self-emancipating, from the South to Indiana. He did help, a few families get relocated. But he's not what I would call like a staunch anti-slavery advocate, right? And the reason why I say this is because if you look at the years, within which, or when he was in office, if you look at his term, those are some of the years when lynching was at its highest in the United States, right? And that was the moment, that I kind of got the kernel, right, that I was going to use to kind of link the paintings together, again, in a broader, right, cultural and critical race narrative. And how I did so was I started looking, again, more deeply at what Michael was wearing and the fact that he has on this chainmail suit, right, of the crusading knight. So you have that. And remember the dates, on these works. So all of these works are done, 1901, 1903, 1907, right at the turn of the century, right? What is happening, in the South at the turn of the 20th century? The very literal re-enslavement of free African Americans, right, through Jim Crow segregation, like the systemization or the systematic establishment, of Jim Crow segregation through convict leasing, debt peonage and sharecropping, and most egregiously through lynching. And what did most of those lynch mob, in the romanticism, right, of the time, we think about Birth of a Nation, the men who were doing, right, that oppressing, that murdering, right, that mob violence, who were enacting that mob violence, by the way, who were sheriffs and deputies and judges, right, and prominent businessmen. They weren't just the kind of bumbling, fumbling, poor whites, as some narratives will have you believe. These were very affluent, white men and their wives who were participating, with them in this activity. And they romanticized themselves as crusading knights. Okay, so you have that history, that is the actual history, right? That is fueling Northern industrialization at the turn of the century. So people like Tiffany, or artists, designers, artisans like Tiffany, like William McGregor Paxson, are, creating for a collector demographic of people, who have the money, right? They are of economic means because they are in some kind of way, right, tied, right, to the reestablishment and the economic benefit of the reestablishment or the re-enslavement and establishment of Jim Crow in the South. Okay. Another narrative that my colleague worked with me, or I should say we worked collaboratively, on in regard, and also in this gallery was the issue of labor, right? And so just to kind of tie that together, to something else, unique about the Tiffany window, or just Tiffany himself, is that he had child labor camps, in Indiana, mining the glass. So again, when you pull the pieces, kind of out of the American mythology, and place them squarely within the context of the time periods upon which they were made, you don't have to do a whole lot of searching, to tie historical American art to contemporary issues, right? Because these contemporary issues also grow out of the fact that we've mythologized the history so much that we've never actually realistically dealt with the issues in the first place. Which lands us here having these same conversations in 2020. And I think, that burden sometimes is unfairly placed, on Black artists, particularly or recently, I think in recent years, on Black contemporary artists, right, to fill those gaps, with their work. And you really don't have to do that. You can really just research the quote unquote white artist work, right? Or the white work. Cause we don't say that, right? We don't say white art, right? Right. We say American art, we say contemporary art, right? But anything having to do with, people of color, artists of color, right? There's always that caveat, and I was, really trying to get away from that, even though I do use some contemporary work in this gallery, or I did use some contemporary work. But it was really important, for me to tease that part out, to say if you put the work back in the context upon which it grew out of, the narrative is pretty much there for you. You don't really have to do, that much research. Or you don't have to do that much research, right, to tell those stories, right? The stories come right out at you. The other thing about this that was so fascinating goes back to gallery design, right? Thinking about the museum space and how museums, both consciously and subconsciously instruct us and socialize us to see. The painting is glazed, right, which means it has like a sheet of glass over it, for protection. And when you stand, right, in particular spaces in the gallery, the Tiffany window is very clearly reflected, right, upon Paxson's female nude, specifically Michael's figure as this knight, right? And what was the fictive lie, basically, that white men were using as a quote unquote justification, right, for redeeming the South, from newly freed African Americans, right? Protecting, the sanctity, of this white ethereal femininity that was also super oppressive to white women, right? So again, there's a narrative, looking at two white male artists' work that allows you to unpack race and racism, that allows you to unpack gender and sexism, right? And that allows you to unpack the mythologies of American art when we think about, Gilded Age work, right? Because all of this work was, made again at the turn of the century. That's typically termed in history, right, as the Gilded Age, like, America's sort of like coming of age, in much like, the 40s and 50s, when slavery was fueling, America's presence, right, on the international stage. Illegal. That was actually made legal. Reinscription of slavery was fueling America's Industrial Revolution. So how does the narrative around, urban realism, right, change when we look at American art through that particular lens, right? And with that, I started to maintain, again, that at the heart of my curatorial practice, is pretty much the assumption that the mythology and the narrative of American art is way more detrimental, right? Way more insidious than it is instructive, right? It is not something that I think we can take wholeheartedly. I don't think we ever should have, and we damn sure shouldn't do it anymore. And if you are, again, to really, if you are dedicated to creating, a culture of equity, a culture of inclusivity, right? A culture of diversity. These are the things, that you have to be truthful about. These are the mirrors, right, that I think institutions really need to take a hard look at themselves through. The other serendipitous thing, about this particular reinstallation, and so this is where the contemporary art comes in, is that there was a collector who has a very, long, standing relationship with the institution, who was downsizing, and needed a place, or wanted to lend, his co-Scott, because he was, he didn't have a wall space, right, in his new home. And he called and he said, would you be interested? And I said, oh, absolutely. And he said, well, where would you put it, Kelly? I said, oh, I have a perfect place for it to go. So needless to say, I hung it next to the Paxton. And what Cole Scott is really saying here, well, one, the title in and of itself says it all, right? Knowledge of the past is the key to the future. But he is playing on the iconography of Saint Sebastian, right, and his martyrdom, for one. But if you notice, right, the figure is half white female, half black male, right? And with these nooses, right, that connect the black woman and the white man. Now, if we know anything about, again, lynching, right, where it's like, oh, we're protecting white women from rape, while at the same time raping black women, at just a rampant rate, right? And with no prosecution, and actually, that does begin to happen, by the 1950s, but what Cole Scott is really trying to tease out is like, racial mixing, and two, that we as Americans not being honest about the realities of what is actually happening, between the races when it comes to sexual violence and physical violence is really something that is going to crucify us all, right, if we don't deal with it responsibly. So this is why you see, this sort of stack of skulls, right, and the heels are on fire. In the background they're painted, very, very, quick, brush strokes, very, very bright color, to say if we don't deal with this, responsibly as a nation, we will always have this issue, between black and white. Lynching is not just something, that negatively affects, communities of color. It also negatively affect white community. And so in a contemporary moment, I would rephrase that and say, if we as, black people in this country, are carrying, whatever kind of trauma as the quote unquote, right, victims, right, of slavery or lynching or Jim Crow segregation, what kind of trauma do you think white folks are carrying as the perpetrators? Or ancestors as the perpetrators of something so heinous that happened for so long, right? That's upheld literally in like every institution, in organization in this country, right, who have not found a way out of that in the ways in which communities of colors have created ways out. Can you think about that? Ask that question, or like really ponder, right, the answer to that question. And I wanted people to really grapple with that. And so I I borrowed the Whitney Museum's title of their 2015 inaugural exhibition when they opened their new building, and tried to start kind of unpacking some of this stuff in their collection. The whole idea of America is really hard to see, and one of the reasons that I thought this was such a brilliant title is particularly for a museum exhibition, is because of the literal ways that museums socialize, instruct, and teach people who can be seen, who's worthy of being seen, who's worthy of having sight, who's not. So that more truthful America, right, is hard to see because it has been oftentimes deliberately erased by the very institution that touts, right, this title. Both me using it at IMA, or borrowing it, as a title for a reinstallation at IMA, as well as the Whitney, and so I try to, or in this, in doing that, right, it was trying to make the institution responsible, right, for its own inequity, in perpetuating, right, inequity. To close, I always like to end, particularly recently, with this Angela Davis quote that, as a Black curator, I act, as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And I do it every single day. As a Black museum professional, unfortunately, I don't have as one of my, Indianapolis colleagues says so eloquently, we don't have the luxury to just do one thing. We have to do it all, and we're not always doing it alone. But in some cases we are, but if we don't act in that way, and not just Black women, right, but just, I think now at this time, Americans in general, if we don't act in that way, another 250 years will go by and we will be having the exact same conversation. And I don't know about you all, but I am not comfortable, with participating in a world where my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren will have to sit here and have these same conversations in their 20s and 30s and 40s. So with that, I hope it gives you a little bit to chew on, when we think about equity, or as you're participating in conversations of equity and diversity and inclusion, not just in your local museums, but in your communities as a whole. Talk to you soon.